Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today on Central Booking, Davida G. Breier reveals the murky depths of her debut suspense novel. Sinkhole interweaves past and present as it follows Michelle Miller on a journey back to Laredo, Florida, a place she left 15 years ago with no intentions of returning. After all, it was there that she found herself engulfed in a toxic bond with gal pal Sissy that would turn deadly, compromising her family, her friends, indeed her very future. But some memories won't be forgotten, and this homecoming will force a reckoning with the guilty conscience that has plagued her ever since. Davida is a native of Florida, but has moved around quite a bit since and currently makes her home in Maryland. While Sinkhole is her first novel, she has worked in publishing for more than 2 decades, most recently at Johns Hopkins University. Her history with the world of zines and indie publishing dates back to 1994. Baltimore's City Paper awarded her with Best Local Zinester in 2000 and Best Zine in 2003. She also won the Literary Deathmatch Baltimore 3.0 event in 2011. Sinkhole then seems a natural progression of her storytelling sensibilities. The great Christopher Zagorski of Bolo Books said, "Sinkhole deserves to be on year-end best-of lists across the board, and this debut novel will amass Davida G. Breier a cult fan following who will anxiously wait to see what she has to offer next." Now, Davida G. Breier invites us to explore the dark, deep, disturbing depths of Sinkhole with her. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Central Booking. I am very excited to be in the company of Davida Breier today. She is the author of the debut suspense novel, Sinkhole, which I think, and I know you desire this, but I really do think this is destined to be a cult classic book. So welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me today.
I am thrilled to have you here. I really enjoyed this book, and it opens with, a really intriguing line that I just loved. And so I'm going to start by asking you about that because the book opens with this line: "When I was 18, I killed my best friend." I mean, you read that and you want to consume the book very, very quickly because you want to find out what happens. But let me ask you about that as a hook. What are the challenges of maintaining the suspense for nearly the entirety of this book based on that, one line alone?
That was tough. I mean, I think to books that I love that maintain that the chapter level cliffhangers that can kind of maintain that pace and that suspense. Armstead Maupin was an inspiration for that. And I mean, I know that a lot of the earlier books they were serialized, so you had to get people to buy the newspaper the next week. But trying to hold that and trying to structure and keep that, what does this mean, as you begin to kind of shift around and see what the main character believes, what may or may not have happened, and watch her begin to piece her own life together.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a terrific hook, and you think, all right, how can this be sustained for so long? You think, I killed my best friend, and then you start to read the story and you realize, that there are actually a couple of best friends, and so that automatically opens, some different doors and raises some questions. But I wanted to ask you about that because this is really a suspense story, but it's also very much a coming of age story. And your protagonist, when we meet her, is an adult and she's called home. And so then we meet her as a teenager. Her name is Michelle, and she has a couple of best friends. These best friends are Sissy and Morrison. So I'm wondering if you can tell us briefly about her relationship with each person individually, and then how the inevitable coming together of the three sort of sparks a very combustible dynamic.
So Sissy, she meets first, and it's very much an intense, you're the best friend I've ever had, narcissistic love bomb, and they get entangled. And they both have something they need from the other one. I mean, they're both in their own ways, these lonely, vulnerable kids. It's just that one is incredibly toxic. The other is making some bad decisions, but she means well. And when Morrison and Michelle begin to make friends, It's very natural. It's very organic. It's very, they actually kind of do this dance for a while before they begin to truly make friends. And the friendship comes from commonalities, from being outsiders, from, having missing father figures, from a lot of things that bring them very close together in a natural way. And in a sense too, when they begin to make friends, they're in Morrison's tree and it's just them. But with Sissy, it's often surrounded by the excess, the house, going out. It's always dynamic and there's motion. There's a stillness and a quietness in the friendship between Michelle and Morrison.
Sure. And then can you talk a bit about how you put all three together and then that stillness and that quietness sort of just blows up?
Again, it's, there's classic triangulation in the way narcissistic people tend to play people off of one another. And initially, Sissy only accepts Morrison with this false assumption that he is Michelle's boyfriend. And, they do eventually all come together and come around to being friends. But again, Sissy always is trying to kind of maneuver things. And Morrison is a young gay man trying to figure out who he is and, what he likes and where, and dealing with that in the mid 80s in a very small town is dangerous for him. He's trying to deal with that. And Sissy, in a way, almost takes ownership of his sexuality. And that too begins to become a place where she starts creating division among the friends.
Sure. And reading this book, I thought to myself, uh-oh, I think I know a few sissies. So if you're reading the book, you might recognize those traits in some people that you know as well. But I'm wondering if for a minute we can expand on the relationship between Michelle and Sissy. As you said, it's very toxic. It's quite corrosive. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about Sissy's influence. And the interesting thing is she seems to be, rich, very privileged, whereas Michelle, not so much. She comes from the poorer side of things. But Sissy's influence on her sort of begins to undermine Michelle's belief, not only in herself, but in her future and even in her family. So I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind speaking to that briefly.
Sure. I mean, Sissy wants to dominate the relationship and she goes at the strongest thing Michelle has. I mean, which is her family, which at, 16, Michelle doesn't quite understand or value in the same way, particularly because Michelle's family is very quiet. They don't talk. They're not, verbally expressive. They're dealing with their own grief and some of their own losses. And Michelle, Michelle doesn't exactly have that wisdom at 16 that she needs to see the value in what she has at home. And Sissy needs to pull her away from that to have complete control over her. So she gets her to devalue herself. She begins making her feel bad for, Sissy really uses class. And I did want to talk about class in Florida because it is, it's something that we as a country really don't like talking about. And the way Sissy tries to use class against her, the way in a sense Michelle doesn't realize the inherent barriers that she has up because she doesn't have a lot of money. It's also something that causes Michelle and Morrison to kind of bond because they get it. They're coming from similar economic backgrounds, but Michelle does begin to use all of these pieces, pulling her away from her family, making her feel bad for being poor, all of this to very slowly erode Michelle's sense of self, her sense of right and wrong, her sense of her own future, where she fits, that she can only fit with Sissy, that she has lost her place at home, that, her future is tied up. And then at the same time, because she's lifting barriers for Michelle, she's showing Michelle, hey, here's what's out in the world. If I'm showing you, there's other places, other people, other things. Michelle gets a taste for wanting to know what is out in the world that she might experience herself. And the tension, especially at that age, of wanting more, not knowing what more is, not knowing where to get it, and it all begins to kind of become this very teenage tension of what the future holds and how to, how that impacts your friendships.
Sure, absolutely. And so, we sort of mentioned that the book does alternate past and present. As you just described, there does become a rift in the family, and that's, evident very, very early in the book because it actually opens in present day. And Michelle has been away from home, I want to say, for 15 years now. And she gets a call from her brother, her half brother, Michael, saying, look, you should probably come home. Mom's in the hospital. And then she does take both sort of a literal and figurative journey home, and then you alternate past and present. I'm wondering if you can talk about, why you chose to use that structure and how you think that doing so raises the stakes and suspense of that journey home after such a protracted period away.
One of the reasons I wanted to structure it like that is because what we remember and what we understand as teens may not be what actually was the truth. It's going to be colored by, having not a full understanding, and maybe, understanding what your parents are going through at that same time. And the heightened sense of memory isn't always true. And so a lot of that journey home is about Michelle as an adult finally confronting some of these memories and taking a minute, go, well, wait a minute. Why did I believe that? Why is that true? Why did I see this way? Maybe this isn't what's real. Maybe I have a lot more questions. And she begins to, she's not an unreliable narrator in the conventional sense. She's not lying to the readers. She's lying to herself. Mm. And it's her beginning to tease apart the fact that she's been lying to herself about some of what happened all these years.
Sure. And I love the psychological bent to this novel because it really does show that we can become prisoners, of our own minds. And not only is some of it based on manipulation, but a lot of times too, it can just be simple misunderstandings. And so the way it plays out seems very organic, but it's also very much compelling. And we've talked a bit about, the teen years in high school. So of course, I'm going to come back to that because it really is such a formative experience for so many of us. And I feel like so many of us either spend much of our adulthood trying to recapture that time or trying to forget it entirely. You can guess, which end of the spectrum I end up on. Spoiler alert, I told Davida before we started talking that I was going to send her my therapy bills because this opened a whole can of worms. And then she told me I wasn't the first person to say that. So I guess I feel, I'm in good company. But I wanted to ask you about that. How did you go about capturing not only, the cultural touchstones, because there are so many specific things that will bring you back to the mid 80s, but also, the seminal emotions and experiences that do evoke a true sense of nostalgia for people who actually lived through that experience and also at that specific time period?
I've been thinking about that as people have been remarking, and I've kind of wondered too, thinking, doesn't everybody kind of remember some of that? And maybe they don't. I particularly remember when I was younger and a teen, and talking to my mother about certain things, and she said that one of the biggest problems she sees is that adults don't remember what it's like. They don't remember, like it's almost becomes this, you just forget and you can't relate. And I remember thinking about that when I was a kid and thinking, well, how do you, never imagining I'd be writing this book, but how do you remember, and when do you forget? And I don't know. I just, I did try to go back to think about how there is this, part of you that if you kind of keep that 13-year-old alive, there are things for you as an adult to go back to go, you okay, you know, I should either be taking advantage and having fun here, or I should really appreciate that I never have to go back to that place and time where you don't understand, you have no agency, you know, things are really hard during those years. And I think that many adults just assume, oh, they're teens, it's easy, they don't have jobs, it's, you know, and it's not. It's a lot of emotional work to grow up.
It truly is. And, reading a book like this, it made me think about, how sometimes we bury our memories or we deny them. And I realized that, I mean, first of all, my experience, I was exaggerating. It wasn't that terrible. It just wasn't great, but, it's not anything too traumatic, nothing like what happens in this book. But it does make you think that those memories are there, they live there, and you sort of just maybe put a lid on them. And then you read something like this, and it all comes back very, viscerally and vividly. And so, maybe teenagers who think their parents are out of touch should give them a copy of this book, because it will bring them back sort of to ground zero. But another topic I wanted to broach was setting or backdrop and the importance of that, because this does play out against Florida. Florida is a place. It's not, the F was not dropped. It's not a mistake. But it's an area, that you're familiar with. You grew up in Florida. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about, that experience in your own upbringing, and then how you see place is enhancing plot, and the ways in which the atmosphere or ambiance of a book like this can actually echo its tone or themes.
Um, so most of the areas that I grew up in, South Florida, were Miami and South. But the thing that I remember best and most about my Florida childhood was wild Florida, was going out to the Everglades, was being outside, was finding weird bugs. That for me was, while I spent time, like most of my time in more urban areas, and not exclusively, some were in semi-rural areas. I really was thinking about that part of wild Florida that is underappreciated. The Florida politics and tourism is what most people not from the state see or think. And there is an underrepresented beauty to some of those wild places. And I wanted to pay homage to that. I wanted to kind of give that piece of the book as much vibrancy as possible. And I kind of, for me, that might be my own nostalgia for the 80s and everything. There's a lot of areas that are so developed that weren't when I was a kid. So as I would find out, I thought it was Florida at first. It's Loretta.
Loretta,
And I was hoping, based on what I could see on the map, that it was still that kind of wild place. And indeed, my research trip showed it was that and more. But I also wanted to give the characters a very claustrophobic, isolated time, the 80s, no internet,
right? Cell phones.
No cell phones, no cable if you couldn't afford it. And so that was part of my intent, was to give them this wild and free yet claustrophobic location. And James Lee Burke is one of my favorites. So I also thought a lot about how the land impacts the people who live there. That Florida is amazing and great if you're, on vacation and you've got a great rental car with air conditioning, and you're going to your hotel with air conditioning, or you have money and have central air. But not everybody did in the 80s. Not everybody does now. And recognizing that plays into that class tension of just how people live and how people perceive people live may be two different things, and that the environment has a lot to do with how individuals exist within the state and with nature.
Absolutely. And I'm going to come back to that in a second, but I did just want to say, I think You sort of nailed it on the head there when you said claustrophobic, because that's the term I kept thinking of when I was reading this book. Or, it's very cloying and oppressive. There's heat, there's humidity, there's bugs and all these tropical storms. And it really does sort of mirror, the isolation of being in your own mind, as being stuck in this very cloying situation. And then you mentioned the land itself. And so I want to really quickly bring the conversation back to the title of the book, which is Sinkhole, because it's such a deceptively, simple title, but there's so much subtext there. So given the conversation that we've just had, I'm wondering if you can talk about how Sinkhole, really is representative, not just of a natural phenomenon, but the themes throughout the book, and then how that title itself in one word really does some heavy lifting to tell the reader what this book is about, even if we don't necessarily realize that until having the benefit of hindsight, having read the book.
And I mean, that is all obviously an area of Florida that is, literally littered with sinkholes, and we see all that, but a lot of it is that the surface looks calm, that we don't really know what is eroding underneath us, how Michelle is being eroded psychologically by Sissy, and what eventually happens when that gives way.
Right. So there you go. Loved the title. And then as I read it, I could appreciate it more and more. And I have a friend, Shuli Kaywood. She's a poet, but she actually, teaches seminars on how to let your titles do the heavy lifting. And granted, I usually think about that in terms of a poem, but obviously it can be quite true for a novel as well. And the more I got into it, the more I could appreciate the depth from something that on a surface layer seems very simple, but is not. So anyway, switching gears for a bit, I wanted to ask you about the transition to becoming a published novelist, because you're not new to the world of publishing, and we'll get to that, but this is your first book. And for a lot of people, that is a dream. And then you achieve that dream and you realize that it's sort of tempered by some of the realities of the business. So can you share your experiences as a first-time author, and what people might not know is expected of an author? Because it's not just writing the best book that you can, but then it's actually introducing it to the world and going out and selling it.
So I started working on Sinkhole in 2017, and I set myself this goal. I was going to try to finish the book in about a year, because I like deadlines, because I needed a deadline. And, I ended up making, I think it was about 15 months before I had a first draft. I've worked in publishing in many different ways. My mother was an independent bookseller. I've worked, for nonprofit publishers, a short stint in a bookstore. I've worked for distributors and doing sales and marketing for years. So I've got all these pieces of information about the industry. Despite knowing all of that, I rushed it. I sent out a manuscript that needed more time and more polish, and the agents that I sent it to passed. And I had sent it to maybe one or two small presses, and again, it wasn't ready, and I was rushing. My job changed, and so I set the manuscript aside, going, I'll come back to it. 2 years went by. I got 9 months into the pandemic, and finally, decided to pick it up again, because I needed to do something that for myself, because it had been a really stressful first 9 months. And that same week, one of the publishers I work with sent me some of their new books for the next season. It was a psychological thriller on their list, which is unusual for the publishers I work with, because I work in university press publishing.
Right.
And one thing led to another. I sent the managing editor a copy of the manuscript with an email that was probably the worst pitch in the history of pitches, telling him he didn't want the book because there was this obvious conflict of interest, and but maybe you have some ideas. And I had the benefit of having worked with G.K. Darby at University of New Orleans for a long time. He knows me, and they liked it. It fit with their list. So the path to finding a publisher was a bit unique. But what really, I think, is the hardest thing, once, even once you found an agent, or once you found a publisher, recognizing that you have 18 solid months of work ahead of you, that, nights and weekends will be spent doing the marketing. Nights and weekends will be spent doing all of learning and understanding that however much you're supported by your publisher, by a publicist, the work is really on you as an author to try to engage with readers, tell people it exists, and do all of this. I think that may be the most unexpected and unanticipated lift in all of this. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're with, a major publisher or you're with a small publisher. A lot of that work in engaging with readers and telling people the book exists does fall to you.
Sure. And I think that's a reality check for so many people, and especially, people who are outside the industry and might take for granted what it means to be an author. You think, all right, the book is done, the work is done. And then you realize that the hard work is just begun, because not only do you have to market this book, but you also, have to work a day job and try to find time to write another book. But I thought I would ask you too, a bit more about your experience at Johns Hopkins University Press, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that, just because I'm kind of intrigued, by academic publishing, because I'm not well versed in that at all. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about what your experiences there are like. What, if anything, did you find lent itself to the transition to novelist or not? And then, how do you switch between the two? Because I have to imagine that it's difficult working a day job and then, coming home and having to work some more at the writing of a book versus selling other people's books. So can you speak to how you make that process work for you?
Sure. So my role at Johns Hopkins, initially, I was working and managing the distribution division. So I work with 15 university presses, all different size, all different lists, but my background has been in small press and nonprofit publishing since almost the beginning. And so working with publishers who are mission driven is perfect. Working with publishers who are not, publishing because they're, trying to cash in, while it would be great to sell books, the goal is this idea of dissemination of knowledge, as making sure that they're putting out the best books possible, publishing works and writers that really need to be read and seen. So working in distribution, I basically understand how books get to where they need to go, all those pieces that once the editing is done, the design is done, all of that, it's the actual logistics and mechanics of how books get to bookstores and into readers' hands. That was very helpful in understanding that piece of the puzzle, because I think that's one that is a little invisible to a lot of authors. They get the marketing, they get the editorial, but that whole piece of how actually books get into stores. I have a split role in which I'm also responsible for sales for Hopkins Press and several of our client publishers. So I am out pitching. I am sharing the new list. I am seeing where books fit in the market and in shelves and which stores are buying what. That's very, very helpful to understand. Stores are just going to pass. It's not right for them. They don't have a fiction section that is has a lot of space. I think for me, one of the biggest and most important pieces is really being part of this culture of academic publishing, where there is sharing and there is support, and we're not competing against one another. We're very often talking to one another, sharing tips and ideas. And so for me, when I'm coming home, when I'm writing, when I'm working on things, I can potentially go to some of my colleagues and, hey, what do you think about doing this? Or how about this as a marketing idea? And they're all very distinct pieces of it. The writing piece is completely separate and creative from, say, the understanding how, inventory valuation and inventory, how all those pieces work. So it's all pieces of the same industry, but it's all different angles. And I feel like one of the greatest gifts I received from this whole process is that I feel like I finally, after all these years, have a 360 view of publishing that I would not have had without this experience.
That's an interesting perspective. And I feel like publishing is this ginormous puzzle, and there's always like a couple of pieces missing, so it seems like you finally got the pieces, so that's terrific. And you spoke of your colleagues, and it was Julia at K Publicity who first put this book on my radar, and she never leads me wrong, so I figured it was worth checking out. But then people will know this name, Christopher Zgorski of Bolo Books too. I think he's one of your colleagues, but then I saw that he endorsed the book, and I'm like, all right, if you have Julia telling you to read the book and Bolo Books telling you to read the book, you should probably read the book. So I will just throw in my 2 cents on that. But it's interesting how worlds kind of converge sometimes, and you have a book land on your doorstep, and then all of a sudden it shows up in your social media feeds, and then you realize that people like Chris are endorsing the book, which is pretty cool. I'm not sure really what my point was with any of that, other than to give a little shout out to Christopher, who's a very well-known name in the crime and mystery community. But it must be interesting to work with him in a different aspect as well, because it's not just talking books and crime, but it's also a day job. So you see different facets of each other's personalities and characters. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all or not.
So at Hopkins Press, we have 4 separate divisions. And while I live in 2 of the 4, Chris was in the journals division. And really for us, it was emails back and forth about books. It wasn't, I didn't interact with him very often in a work capacity, but it was hey, did you read this? Or, oh, I think you'll love this, and so that, happened back and forth for a while. He knew I was working on the book, but I didn't want to spoil anything. And I waited till I had galleys and I went, here you go. And just let him do, without a lot of prep or kind of a cold read, let me know what you think. And it was really, really amazing to see when he posted that review.
Yeah, that's pretty great. And he's certainly, an excellent ally to have. So I wanted to ask you too, if my understanding is correct, I think you do have a background in editing as well, right?
So I've worked in really small press zines since the mid 90s, and I've been, publishing those just for fun. And there was kind of a point in time within the zine community where we had lost a whole lot of the zine review zines. And I decided, well, you know what, I can help fill that gap. I'm pretty good at organizing things. And so I've been publishing a zine review zine since 1999, just to help support fellow creators. And my role in that, I actually have a friend, a zine friend, who is also works in publishing, who does a lot of the heavy lift on the editorial piece of it. I may mostly organize, and she does a lot of the editing now.
Well, that's a nice balance to have when you have 2 people who have different skill sets and work so well together. So I'm not sure if this question will really pertain to you or not, but I was going to ask, with having some background in editing, I was just wondering, giving feedback to others, how do you apply that to your own writing? And have you found that having that experience sort of informs how you take feedback now from your own editorial team? Does that change how you're able to receive feedback when you've sort of been on the other end giving that kind of feedback to other writers?
I think in this particular experience, the editor that I worked with at University of New Orleans was phenomenal. That, she knew when I was being lazy, and she called me out on it. She knew when I needed to, actually have the characters talk, and her feedback and her cheerleading as I went through the edit, I feel like was one of the most intensive collaborative processes I've ever experienced. And, and I think in 99% of the time, she was spot on. Like, push here, do the, is this really what he'd be thinking? And I think that she made the book so much stronger, and her feedback, I felt like I was very open to. There's only one point at which she was like, I think you need to do this thing here. And I was like, oh, I don't want to do that thing there. And I sat on it and I was like, no, she has an idea, but I got to take it in my own way. And I think that having had the experiences that I've had, I felt strong enough on my own convictions to go, no, I don't want to do that, but I can do this. But then also be able to take in all of the, any place there was criticism or suggestion, go, I need to think that through. And yeah, that's the right way. That's a good idea.
Sure. Well, that sounds like a really enriching process, actually, which is terrific because I know not everybody always feels that way about the editorial process. But I think it's a gift not only to be able to give criticism that is constructive, but also, to be able to receive it. That makes it, I think, probably a much more pleasurable experience if you have that level of respect and understanding. I did want to take you back in time a bit, though, because you mentioned before that your mom was an indie bookseller. Yay, love indie bookstores. And that you worked in bookstores for a short period of time. But I'm wondering if you can tell me what you recall, of your early relationship with stories and words and how your reading life has influenced now your writing life.
I was one of those kids that always had a book on them. I was one of those kids that, would be scrooched up against the back of like the wall while other kids were doing whatever, because I was a reader. And, I was reading just all sorts of whatever I could get my hands on. Getting lost in a book is the best thing. Losing time, forgetting what you're doing, getting that involved in the characters. And so I was always around books. I mean, I was around them at home. I wasn't an outgoing kid. I was often the new kid because we moved. And there'd be no getting through, there would be no getting through days as a kid without a book at hand. So for me, that was the level of respect and just, always kind of being in the orbit of books that I think made it so hard for me to finally break through and say, okay, I really want to do this. I want to write fiction, because I always thought that would be the hardest thing to do, to create and then inhabit a world nonstop, to create something that made sense and was well written.
Sure. But books do make the greatest companions. And I was always that kid too, with a book in my hands. And it just made me remember, but in middle school, we didn't have like a graduation ceremony like they do these days, but there was sort of an end of the year montage where they did this whole picture collage, and I remember everybody was doing all these fun, active things. And my picture was me holding a book, walking through the parking lot at recess. And I'm like, that really kind of, just sums it up perfectly. But I wanted to ask you too, growing up, being such a voracious reader and enjoying the company of books, have you found that your relationship with reading has changed now that you actually work in the industry? Because I find a lot of people that I talk to who write, and work, not to say that writing isn't work, because it is, but a lot of people have to balance, full-time jobs with writing on the side. And then often at times I feel the reading falls away for people because they just don't have the time, to pleasure read as much as they used to. So I'm wondering, what has your experience been like with that, especially as somebody who loved books so much growing up? Do you still have that ability to read, or how do you balance, the joys of one thing versus another?
Probably the greatest thing to happen to enable me to keep reading, maybe not as voraciously. I mean, I have work, I have home, I have my own projects. It's, it is hard, but I find that I don't feel great psychologically if I'm not reading. Like, I feel like I have to get out of my head and into someone else's to kind of like let the dust settle. Otherwise it's just my own noise. And audiobooks. Audiobooks, if it weren't for audiobooks, I wouldn't get to read as much as I do now. If it weren't for audiobooks, my house would never get cleaned by me. I do yard work, I drive, I have stuff, I'll pop it on and jump into someone else's head and world for a while. That helps me keep reading. My day job is largely nonfiction, so there's a distinct difference too between the two worlds.
Sure. And I think that's great advice because I think a lot of times people, forget how versatile an audiobook can be, and you can do so many other things at the same time. Like I've finally learned that if I'm going walking, which is not something I tend to enjoy very much, I put on an audiobook and the time passes really quickly. And it's like, all right, I've done something, good for my physical being, but that's also been my safe space, my sanity space. And then at night before I go to bed, if I can pick up a book and actually read for a bit,
Yeah.
all the better. All right, final two questions for you because obviously you have much life to get back to. But everybody who comes on the show, I ask for words of guidance or advice because there are always people seeking that. So, in reflecting upon a creative life or a writing life more specifically, what would you say is the best advice that you were ever given? And then the best advice that you were never given and had to learn for yourself throughout the process of actually doing the work?
Um, the best advice I was ever given. Let me come back to that one. Let me answer the second question first. Let me think about the first one. I think the thing that I had to learn in this whole process was to give myself the grace to be bad at something. I thought I had to be good. I thought I had to have it all together. I kept telling myself as I was younger, no, you can't write a novel. You don't have enough life experience. No, you can't write a novel. You don't know how to do that. You don't have any credentials. No, you can't write a novel. You know, you don't have the time. And I kept coming up with reasons I couldn't do it. And then I stopped myself from doing it, and giving myself the grace to do a thing and be bad at it and have it go nowhere and just let it be a waste of time. What's the worst that'll happen? You've spent some time doing this, and it doesn't come to fruition. That's okay. And to me, getting past needing to be good and allowing myself the freedom to fail was the best thing I did for myself in this process. Um, do I wish I had done it earlier? Maybe, but it would have been a different book.
Right.
And I think this is the book I needed to write right now. That that was the story I had to tell, and those were the characters that I needed to tell. As far as advice, I can think back. I think maybe it isn't specific advice, but I think back to mentors that I've had from from junior high on through my professional career. And sometimes the best advice was being given an opportunity and taking it, and that not recognizing at that time that's what they were doing, and that they were making space for me to move forward, to learn something, to experience something, to see something. And that is something that in hindsight, as I've seen what other people did for me, I try to make a very conscious effort to make that space, bring people into conversations, expose them, and let them make those choices, decide what they want to learn or do, or just give them those opportunities that I was given, even if it wasn't explicitly stated that was what was being done.
Sure. Hindsight really is the gift. But I love what you said too about giving yourself, the grace to try and do something, even if you fail at it or you're not great at it, because I think so many of us, find excuses not to write, and maybe it isn't the right time. But I think, oh, if I'm going to write, well, I'm not going to be able to read, or I'm not going to be able to put as much energy, into the things that I have to do all day long. And so it's very easy for me to find those reasons not to do it. And I can imagine for a lot of other people too. But then, you look at somebody such as yourself who finally gave yourself permission, and you have this, wonderful book that very much speaks for itself. But you say, all right, it can be done, and you can have a very rich personal life and professional life and creative life, and all of those things can kind of converge and come together. So I really appreciate you sharing, that with us and your story. And I always feel bad doing this because you put so much energy and time and thought into writing a book and putting it out into the world. And then my last question tends to be, can you leave us with a teaser of what might be percolating now, what readers might, be able to expect next, even though really you're presenting this book right here to the world. But are there any thoughts about, another novel? And if so, do you feel like you can tease that in any fashion?
Um, it's funny because I've started having this character kind of creep up. It's the same thing that the others would do, where they'd kind of go, "Hey, I like this thing. I work at this place," you know, and I've started making some notes. I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure I'm gonna stick with Florida. I kind of like that as a setting. I kind of like there's just a richness there culturally and environmentally. So I don't have it all worked out, but I definitely have a whole lot of pages in my notebook of a couple characters starting to take shape and tell me who they are.
That's terrific. That's very promising. And I think one of the great things about being a writer is you hear that voice in your head, and that's a very legitimate, thing. And you can say, well, I'm a writer. There's a voice in my head, and that probably means that there's going to be another story real soon. But in the meantime, I really do hope that people pick up Sinkhole, because it's absolutely engrossing. It's riveting. It's psychological suspense, but there's just so much more to it. And I found it to be a very immersive reading experience. So I'm sure that others will as well. So Davida, thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing so much with us about writing and your path to publication. It's much appreciated.
And I did think of one other tiny piece of advice,
Sure.
and that is, we all have heroes. We all have literary heroes, and I think that's sometimes a stumbling block, because, oh my God, my hero, like, I'm never going to write anything as good as that. It's not a race and it's not a competition. Like, they are fantastic. You should always read your heroes, but let them do what they do, and you're going to do what you do, and you don't have to compete with them, and find your own space on the shelf.
That's outstanding. Well, you might just be my new literary hero. But I'm glad to know that I don't have to try to compete with this book, because it's funny. You do read things and then you say, why bother even trying, because I can't compete with this. But really, I think you're competing, with yourself. And if you write a book, you have achieved something terrific. You have done that, and you've shared that whole journey with us today. So I really, really appreciate it. And I do hope people pick up the book. And then maybe, a couple of years from now, you'll come back and visit us and tell us about that person who's been peeping in your ear.
Absolutely.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.